It was a warm, golden afternoon in the heart of a bustling city. The kind of day that makes you feel like anything is possible. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows of an upscale restaurant, casting a soft glow on the polished floors and elegant decor. Every table was dressed with crisp white linens, glistening glassware, and fresh flowers. It was a place where people came to celebrate milestones, close business deals, or simply indulge in life's finer things. In the corner, a well-dressed woman sat alone at a table. She exuded an air of confidence, her designer handbag perched proudly on the chair beside her. Her platinum blonde hair was styled perfectly, and her every movement seemed calculated, deliberate. She glanced around the room, her eyes briefly scanning the other patrons before settling on her menu. Everything about her screamed wealth and privilege. Across the room, a young server was weaving through the tables with practiced ease, balancing trays of steaming dishes and sparkling drinks. He wore the standard uniform, but there was something about his demeanor, a quiet dignity, a professionalism that set him apart. His warm smile and attentive service hadn't gone unnoticed by the other guests, who nodded appreciatively as he passed by. But when the server approached the woman's table, the atmosphere shifted. She didn't look up at first, too engrossed in her phone. When he gently cleared his throat, her eyes flicked upward, and for a moment they locked onto his. There was a pause, and then her expression hardened. "I'll wait for someone else," she said curtly, her voice cold enough to freeze the warmth of the day. "I don't need your help." The server hesitated, his smile faltering slightly. "Is there something I can do to make your experience better, ma'am?" he asked, his tone polite, professional. She let out a soft, disdainful laugh, leaning back in her chair. "I don't think you understand. I don't want you serving me. Get someone else." The server blinked, a flicker of hurt crossing his face, but he quickly recovered. "Of course," he said, his voice steady. He turned and walked away, his posture as straight as ever. The woman watched him go, her lips curling into a smirk. She picked up her phone again, her fingers tapping away as if nothing had happened. Around her, the other patrons exchanged uneasy glances, whispering to one another. A few shook their heads in disapproval, but no one said a word. Meanwhile, the server quietly informed a colleague about the situation and resumed his work without complaint. Despite the sting of the encounter, he continued to serve every other table with the same warmth and dedication. But life has a way of balancing the scales, doesn't it? What goes around comes around. And sometimes, karma works faster than you'd expect. As the woman sipped her wine, relishing the power she felt in dismissing someone so easily, she had no idea that the balance was already shifting. She didn't notice the subtle changes around her, the way the staff exchanged glances, the way the manager's eyes followed her. She was too wrapped up in her own world, too confident that her money and status shielded her from consequences. But karma doesn't knock on the door and wait politely. It barges in, uninvited, and when it arrives, it demands attention. And oh, it was coming. The woman remained absorbed in her world, oblivious to the subtle shifts around her. Her phone buzzed with messages, most of them congratulatory notes, from friends who envied her lifestyle. She reveled in the compliments, occasionally glancing up to sip her wine or admire her reflection in the glass window. Everything about her seemed effortless, as though the world itself had bent to accommodate her desires. But behind the scenes, things were beginning to stir. The restaurant staff, though professional and discreet, were exchanging quiet words. The server, now busy attending to other tables, kept his composure, but there was a quiet resolve in his eyes. He wasn't one to dwell on negativity, yet something about the encounter lingered in his mind. It wasn't the first time he'd faced such treatment, and unfortunately, he knew it likely wouldn't be the last. Still, he carried himself with grace, determined not to let one person's prejudice define his day. The manager, a sharp-eyed man with years of experience in the industry, had observed the interaction from a distance. He prided himself on running a place where everyone's staff and patrons alike felt respected and valued. Watching the woman dismiss one of his best servers so coldly didn't sit right with him. But he knew better than to jump to conclusions. He decided to keep an eye on her, sensing there was more to this situation than met the eye. Meanwhile, the other guests in the restaurant were growing increasingly aware of the tension. A couple at a nearby table whispered quietly, casting disapproving glances in the woman's direction. A group of friends seated by the window exchanged knowing looks, their conversation momentarily hushed. The air seemed heavier, charged with unspoken thoughts and unshared words. The woman, however, was unfazed. She had grown used to being the center of attention, though in her mind, it was always for the right reasons. She was wealthy, successful, and accustomed to a certain level of reverence from those around her. To her, the server's presence had been an unwelcome blemish on an otherwise perfect afternoon. She didn't see her actions as cruel or unjust, they were simply her exercising her preferences. In her world, money spoke louder than words, and she believed it entitled her to a level of service that matched her high standards. But life has a way of revealing the cracks beneath the surface, even in the most carefully curated facades. And as the minutes ticked by, those cracks were beginning to show. A sudden commotion near the kitchen drew the attention of the patrons. One of the servers had tripped, sending a tray of dishes crashing to the floor. The sound echoed through the restaurant, followed by a moment of stunned silence. The young server who had been dismissed earlier was quick to react, rushing over to help clean up the mess. His efficiency and calm demeanor earned him a few murmurs of appreciation from nearby diners, but the woman barely glanced up from her phone. The manager, however, took notice. He watched as the server assisted his colleague, his actions speaking volumes about his character. It was clear that this young man was not only competent but also deeply committed to his work. The manager felt a pang of frustration as he thought about the earlier incident. How could someone so dedicated be treated with such disdain? As the afternoon wore on, the woman's sense of superiority remained unshaken. She ordered more wine, occasionally flagging down a different server with a flick of her wrist. Her voice carried across the room, and though her words were polite, there was an edge to her tone that made it clear she considered herself above those serving her. What she didn't realize was that every action, every word, was being quietly observed. The staff moved around her with a mix of professionalism and quiet resolve, while the other diners grew increasingly uneasy. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted, and though no one said it aloud, everyone was waiting for something to happen. And then, as if on cue, a figure appeared at the entrance. A man, dressed in a tailored suit, stepped into the restaurant, his presence commanding immediate attention. He exuded an air of authority, his sharp eyes scanning the room before landing on the woman's table. For a moment, he hesitated, as though taking in the scene, before making his way over to her. The woman looked up, her expression brightening as she recognized him. Finally, she said, setting her phone down. "I was starting to think you weren't coming." The man smiled, though there was something guarded about his demeanor. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, his movements deliberate. "Sorry for the delay," he said. "Busy day." Their conversation quickly turned to business, the woman speaking animatedly about her latest ventures. She seemed eager to impress, her words laced with subtle boasts about her accomplishments. The man listened politely, occasionally nodding or offering a comment, but there was a distance in his eyes, as though his mind was elsewhere. As their conversation continued, the server from earlier approached the table, this time carrying a small tray with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. He placed the items on the table with practiced ease, his expression neutral. The woman barely acknowledged him, but the man glanced up, his brow furrowing slightly as he took in the server's face. "Thank you," the man said, his tone sincere. The server nodded, offering a polite smile before stepping away. The man watched him go, a thoughtful look on his face. He turned back to the woman, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You didn't mention there was an issue with the service," he said, his voice low. The woman shrugged, dismissing the comment with a wave of her hand. "Oh, it's nothing," she said lightly. "I just prefer a certain level of service, you know? It's not personal." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he picked up his glass and swirled the wine thoughtfully. "Interesting," he murmured, more to himself than to her. The tension at the table was palpable, though the woman seemed oblivious. She continued talking, her words flowing freely as she recounted stories of her travels and triumphs. But the man's attention had shifted, his gaze occasionally drifting across the room to where the young server was now assisting another table. The minutes stretched on, and the sense of unease grew. It was as if the entire restaurant was holding its breath, waiting for the next moment to unfold. The woman, still unaware of the storm brewing around her, carried on with her afternoon, confident in her place at the top of the world. But as we all know, life has a way of leveling the playing field. And for her, the reckoning was just beginning. The man continued to listen as the woman talked, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't shake the image of the young server, the quiet dignity with which he carried himself despite the earlier slight. It wasn't just the act itself that lingered in the man's mind, but the way the server had handled it, calm, professional, and unshaken. There was a strength there, a resilience that was hard to ignore. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass, and let his eyes wander across the restaurant. The staff moved efficiently, each person playing their role to perfection, yet his focus kept returning to the server. The man was no stranger to human behavior, and he prided himself on his ability to read people. Something about the server's demeanor struck him as particularly noteworthy. There was a story there, one that he couldn't quite piece together yet. Meanwhile, the woman's voice continued to fill the air between them, her words blending into a rhythm of self-assured declarations and veiled critiques of those she deemed beneath her. The man nodded occasionally, but his responses were growing shorter, more perfunctory. If the woman noticed his waning attention, she didn't show it. Her confidence was unshakable, a fortress built on years of privilege and power. Across the room, the server was now attending to an elderly couple. His interactions were warm and genuine, his smile returning easily as he helped them navigate the menu. The couple seemed delighted by his attentiveness, their laughter breaking through the subdued hum of the restaurant. It was a stark contrast to the earlier scene, and the man at the woman's table couldn't help but take note. The woman paused briefly to check her phone, her fingers scrolling rapidly through emails and messages. She made a comment about a recent investment, her voice tinged with pride. The man responded with a distracted his eyes still following the server's movements. Finally, he set his glass down and leaned forward slightly. "You've always been good at getting what you want," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. The woman looked up, a pleased smile on her face. "It's all about knowing your worth," she replied. "People respect confidence." "True," he said, nodding slowly. "But sometimes, it's also about recognizing the worth in others." The woman raised an eyebrow, a hint of confusion in her expression. "What are you getting at?" she asked, her tone light but with an edge of curiosity. Before the man could respond, the manager approached their table, his expression polite but firm. "Excuse me for interrupting," he said smoothly. "I just wanted to check in and make sure everything is to your satisfaction." The woman waved her hand dismissively. "Everything's fine," she said, her tone curt. "Though I appreciate the follow-up." The manager smiled, though his eyes briefly flickered toward the man, who gave him a slight nod. "We strive to provide the best experience for all our guests," the manager continued. "If there's anything else you need, don't hesitate to let us know." With that, he stepped away, leaving the two of them alone once more. The woman seemed unfazed, but the man's expression had shifted. There was a thoughtful intensity in his gaze, as though he was carefully considering his next words. "You know," he said after a pause, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier. About preferences and standards." The woman tilted her head slightly, her curiosity piqued. "And?" He leaned in a little closer. "There's a fine line between having high standards and dismissing people unfairly. Sometimes, the way we treat others says more about us than it does about them." The woman frowned, a flicker of defensiveness crossing her face. "I don't see how this is relevant," she said, her tone cool. "I simply prefer to be served by people who meet my expectations." "And what are those expectations?" he asked, his voice calm but probing. "Because from where I'm sitting, that young man has been nothing but professional." She bristled slightly, her shoulders tensing. "It's not about professionalism," she said. "It's about comfort. I shouldn't have to explain myself." The man studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Maybe not," he said finally. "But sometimes, the explanations we avoid are the ones we need to hear the most." The tension between them was palpable, an unspoken challenge hanging in the air. The woman crossed her arms, her lips pressing into a thin line. She wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone she considered an ally. But before she could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices near the entrance. Everyone in the restaurant turned to look as a man in a delivery uniform argued with one of the staff. His voice was agitated, his gestures animated. The staff member, a younger hostess, looked flustered, trying to calm him down. The manager quickly intervened, stepping between them and speaking in a low, firm tone. The woman sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "Can't even manage a simple delivery without causing a scene," she muttered. The man beside her didn't respond. His attention was focused on the interaction unfolding at the door. As the argument de-escalated, the delivery man stormed out, and the manager turned back toward the dining area. His eyes briefly met the man's, and there was a silent exchange of understanding. The server returned to their table to refill their water glasses, his movements precise and efficient. This time, the man made a point of acknowledging him. "Thank you," he said, his tone warm. The server nodded, his expression professional but appreciative. "You're welcome, sir," he said quietly before moving on to the next table. The woman watched the exchange with mild irritation, her earlier confidence now tinged with unease. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something about the atmosphere had shifted. It was as if the balance of power in the room had subtly tilted, leaving her on uncertain ground. The man leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Funny thing about respect," he said after a moment. "It's not something you can buy. It's earned, often in the quiet moments when no one's watching." The woman's eyes narrowed, her posture stiffening. "What exactly are you trying to say?" she asked, her voice low. He smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "Sometimes it's the people we overlook who teach us the most important lessons." The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of his words settling over the table. The woman stared at him, her mind racing. For the first time that afternoon, she found herself at a loss for words. The woman sat in silence, her mind swirling with unspoken thoughts. The man's words lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. She wasn't used to being challenged, least of all in a public setting like this. Her confidence, once so unshakable, now felt like a thin veneer barely holding back a storm of doubt. She sipped her wine, hoping the familiar taste would steady her nerves, but it did little to calm the growing unease inside her. Across the room, the server continued his work, moving between tables with the same quiet efficiency. But there was something different now. He could feel the weight of the stares, the subtle shifts in energy as more and more eyes turned his way. He wasn't sure why, but it was clear that something was building. The tension was almost palpable, a silent current running through the restaurant. The manager, ever vigilant, watched it all unfold from a distance. He could sense the shift as well, though he wasn't entirely sure what had sparked it. Still, his instincts told him to stay close, ready to step in if needed. He trusted his team to handle whatever came their way, but he also knew that sometimes, situations required a steady hand and a calm presence to guide them. The woman glanced around the restaurant, her gaze flitting from table to table. She noticed the other diners whispering, their eyes darting toward her and then away. Her pulse quickened. Were they talking about her? She couldn't be sure, but the thought unsettled her. She prided herself on her composure, on her ability to command a room with ease. But now, for the first time in a long while, she felt exposed. The man across from her watched her closely, his expression unreadable. He could see the cracks forming in her carefully constructed facade, the way her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, the way her eyes darted nervously around the room. He said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them. Sometimes silence could be more powerful than words, and he knew this was one of those moments. Finally, she set her glass down with a soft clink. "I don't see what all of this has to do with me," she said, her voice carefully measured. "I came here for a nice meal, and that's exactly what I've had." The man leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Did you?" he asked, his tone calm but pointed. "Or did you come here to be served, to be catered to, without ever considering the people who make that possible?" Her eyes flashed with irritation. "Is that a crime now?" She shot back. "I've worked hard to get where I am. I deserve to enjoy the fruits of my labor without being judged for it." "No one's judging your success," he said evenly. "But there's a difference between enjoying your success and using it as a shield to avoid accountability." She opened her mouth to respond but stopped short as the server returned, this time carrying a small plate with a single dessert. He placed it gently on the table, his movements precise and deliberate. "Compliments of the chef," he said quietly, his eyes meeting the man's for a brief moment before shifting back to the woman. The woman frowned. "I didn't order this," she said, her tone clipped. The server's expression remained neutral. "It's a special dish," he explained. "The chef wanted to share something meaningful with you." The man's eyes flickered with interest. He could tell there was more to the story, and he was curious to see where it would lead. The woman, however, seemed less intrigued. She eyed the dessert with suspicion, her earlier irritation resurfacing. "I don't see why that's necessary," she said, pushing the plate aside. The server hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I'll let the chef know," he said before turning and walking away. The woman sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I don't understand why everyone's making such a big deal out of this," she muttered. "It's just a meal." The man didn't respond immediately. He watched as the server disappeared into the kitchen, his mind racing. There was something about the way the server had spoken, the quiet intensity in his voice, that hinted at a deeper story. And then, as if on cue, the restaurant's main door opened, and a new figure stepped inside. It was an older woman, her posture straight and her eyes sharp. She was dressed modestly but carried herself with a quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. She paused in the doorway, her gaze sweeping over the room until it landed on the young server. Her face softened, and she made her way toward him with purposeful strides. The server's eyes widened slightly as he saw her approach. He quickly set down the tray he was holding and met her halfway, his expression a mix of surprise and apprehension. They exchanged a few quiet words, their conversation too low for anyone else to hear. But whatever was said, it seemed to carry a significant weight. The man watched the interaction with growing curiosity, his mind piecing together fragments of the puzzle. The woman at his table, however, seemed largely uninterested. She glanced at her phone, clearly eager to move on from whatever drama was unfolding around her. But the moment was far from over. As the older woman and the server continued their hushed conversation, the manager approached, his expression calm but serious. He joined them, his presence adding another layer of gravity to the situation. The three of them spoke for several minutes, their voices low and measured. Finally, the older woman turned, her gaze sweeping over the dining area until it landed on the woman's table. She paused for a moment, her expression unreadable, before making her way over with quiet determination. The woman looked up, her brows furrowing in mild annoyance, as the older woman stopped beside their table. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. The older woman didn't respond immediately. She glanced at the man, who gave her a subtle nod, then turned her attention back to the woman. "I think we need to talk," she said, her voice calm but firm. The woman stared at her, confused. "Do we know each other?" she asked, her tone laced with skepticism. The older woman smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "No," she said. "But perhaps we should." The woman blinked, her confusion deepening. The older woman stood there, calm and unyielding, her steady gaze refusing to waver. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath, diners straining to catch bits of the unfolding confrontation. The tension was thick, an invisible thread tightening with each passing second. "I'm sorry," the woman said, her tone clipped, "but I don't see how this concerns you. If there's an issue, I suggest you take it up with the staff." The older woman didn't flinch. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said evenly. "I'm here because there's something you need to understand." The man sitting across from the woman leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. He could sense that whatever was coming next would shift the dynamic even further. The woman, however, was less impressed. She crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "I've had enough lectures for one day," she said, her voice edged with impatience. "So unless you have something important to say—" "I do," the older woman interrupted, her tone firm but measured. "And it's not just about today. It's about a pattern. A pattern of behavior that goes deeper than you realize." The woman frowned, her irritation growing. "What are you talking about?" The older woman hesitated, her eyes searching the woman's face. "You've built your life on certain beliefs," she said slowly. "Beliefs about what you deserve, about who is worthy of your time and respect. But have you ever stopped to think about the people you overlook? The ones who make your world run smoothly while remaining invisible to you?" The woman's mouth tightened, her patience wearing thin. "I don't have time for this," she said, reaching for her purse. "I came here for a meal, not a lecture on social dynamics." The older woman's gaze hardened. "This isn't just about today's meal," she said quietly. "It's about something you did a long time ago. Something you probably don't even remember." At this, the woman froze. There was a slight tremor in her hand as she slowly set her purse back down. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice quieter now, tinged with a hint of unease. The older woman glanced toward the kitchen, where the server had retreated. "Do you recognize him?" she asked softly. The woman blinked, her brow furrowing. "He's just a server," she said after a pause. "Why should I?" The older woman shook her head, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "He wasn't always. Years ago, he was a bright, ambitious young man working his first job. And one day you crossed paths." The woman's confusion deepened. "I've never met him before today." "You have," the older woman insisted. "But it was brief. You were in a rush, annoyed by something, and you said things you probably forgot the moment you walked away. But those words, they stayed with him." The restaurant seemed to grow quieter, the weight of the revelation settling over the room. The man across the table leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. He watched as the woman processed the older woman's words, her face shifting between disbelief and uncertainty. "This is ridiculous," the woman said finally, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "You're saying I had some kind of impact on him?" That doesn't make sense. The older woman nodded slowly. It might not make sense to you, but to him, it meant everything. That encounter shaped his view of the world, of himself. And yet, despite it all, he persevered. The woman shook her head, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. I don't even remember any of this. How can I be responsible for something I don't recall? The older woman's expression softened. It's not about blame, she said gently. It's about awareness. About understanding that our actions, even the ones we think are insignificant, can leave lasting marks on others. The woman's eyes darted toward the kitchen, where the server was now standing silently, his gaze fixed on the floor. For the first time, a flicker of recognition crossed her face, though it was fleeting. She looked back at the older woman, her defenses slowly crumbling. Why are you telling me this now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The older woman hesitated, then sighed. Because sometimes, people need a moment of clarity. A chance to see beyond their own perspective and understand the impact they have on others. The man across the table watched the exchange with a growing sense of anticipation. He could see the shift happening, the cracks in the woman's armor widening as she grappled with the weight of the older woman's words. The air in the room was electric, charged with the unspoken truths hanging between them. And then, just as the tension seemed unbearable, the older woman stepped back, her expression resolute. I've said what I needed to say, she said quietly. The rest is up to you. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the woman alone with her thoughts. The server watched her go, his face a mixture of emotions: relief, gratitude, and something deeper, harder to define. The woman sat in stunned silence, her mind racing. For the first time, she began to see herself through the eyes of those she had dismissed so easily. And though she didn't yet know what she would do next, one thing was certain: her world would never be the same. The woman stared at the table, the weight of the older woman's words sinking in. Her mind replayed the brief exchange she'd had with the server earlier in the evening, searching for some connection, some details she might have overlooked. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't recall anything specific. The idea that a single moment, a fleeting interaction from her past, could ripple out and shape someone else's life left her unsettled. The man across from her said nothing, simply observing as she wrestled with her thoughts. The usual confidence in her demeanor was gone, replaced by a quiet vulnerability. She looked up briefly, her eyes meeting his, but quickly glanced away, as though ashamed of what he might see. A few minutes later, the server returned, this time holding a small envelope. He placed it gently on the table in front of her without a word. The woman looked at him, her mouth opening as if to speak, but the words didn't come. The server gave a polite nod and turned to leave, but she stopped him. Wait, she said softly, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. He paused, turning back to face her. His expression remained professional. But how do you even begin to fix something like this? He smiled gently. Start small, he said. Change isn't about grand gestures, it's about the little things you do every day. Treat people with kindness, listen more than you speak, and don't be afraid to admit when you're wrong. She nodded slowly, taking his words to heart. There was no quick fix, no easy way to undo the past, but she was determined to try. The night wasn't just a wake-up call, it was a turning point, a chance to rewrite her story. As the restaurant began to quiet down, the server approached their table once more. This time, his demeanor was lighter, almost as if a burden had been lifted. Is there anything else I can get for you? He asked, his tone polite but warm. The woman hesitated, then smiled. No, thank you, she said softly. But I want to say, I appreciate everything you've done tonight. More than you know. The server gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. It was my pleasure, he said before turning to attend to another table. The man and woman exchanged a glance, and for the first time that evening, there was a sense of understanding between them. They had come into the night as strangers, but the shared experience had created an unspoken bond. As they prepared to leave, the woman reached for the check, but the man stopped her. "Allow me," he said, placing his card on the table. She started to protest but then caught herself. Instead, she offered a grateful smile. "Thank you," she said sincerely. They left the restaurant together, stepping out into the cool night air. The city buzzed around them, its energy a stark contrast to the quiet introspection they both felt. They walked in silence for a while, the events of the evening still fresh in their minds. Finally, the woman spoke. "Do you think people can really change?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. The man considered her question for a moment. "I think change is possible," he said. "But it's not easy. It takes time, effort, and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths about yourself. The fact that you're even asking that question is a good sign." She nodded, the weight of his words settling over her. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but she was ready to take the first steps. Over the next few weeks, the woman began to make small but meaningful changes in her life. She made an effort to engage with the people around her, from her coworkers to the barista at her favorite coffee shop. She listened more, spoke less, and learned to see the world through different eyes. One day, she returned to the restaurant, this time alone. She asked to be seated in the section where the young server worked and waited patiently as he made his rounds. When he finally approached her table, he seemed surprised but not unfriendly. "Welcome back," he said, his tone neutral. "What can I get for you today?" She smiled, her nerves showing slightly. "Actually, I just wanted to talk," she said. "If you have a moment." He hesitated but then pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his expression cautious but open. She took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened the last time I was here," she said. "And I want you to know how much it's changed me. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to thank you for giving me the chance to see things differently." The server nodded slowly, his eyes searching hers. "I appreciate that," he said. "It's not often people are willing to take a hard look at themselves. It means a lot." They talked for a while, sharing their experiences and learning from each other's perspectives. By the end of the conversation, there was a sense of closure, a feeling that both of them had found some peace. As the woman left the restaurant that day, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The experience had taught her the value of humility, empathy, and the power of human connection. She knew she still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. The man, too, reflected on the night's events. He realized that life had a way of bringing people together in unexpected ways, often for reasons they couldn't fully understand at the time. And sometimes, those moments of connection could spark profound change not just in others, but within themselves. In the end, the woman's journey wasn't just about redemption, it was about growth, understanding, and the realization that every interaction, no matter how small, has the potential to leave a lasting impact. And as she moved forward, she carried that lesson with her, determined to make the most of every moment and every connection life had to offer.